We were... we were defeated.
Welcome to the show. Today I wanted to discuss scripted failure in games and some of the pitfalls as well as positive things about them, and really why they are so difficult to get right, and use a couple of examples, one from my favorite set of games of all time, Free Space, and then another one from Mass Effect, and I will admit I am a little bit cherry picking Mass Effect 3's bad example because it's very well known to be bad, but I wanted to really get into why I think it's considered such a terrible spot in the game and really what we can do as designers to get past that. And it's hard, but that's what this episode's for. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about why scripted failure in a game is so much more difficult to do right than failure in any other kind of story. And it really boils down to the audience's role. In films, books, plays, what have you, the audience doesn't have any control. They don't have any agency over what's going on. And agency is a very important word for this discussion, and I want to thank Michael Matias for his really getting me onto this. And he's a professor at UC Santa Cruz who's done some very cool stuff. But back on topic, agency is what you want to have in a game. Game is really about the amount of agency a player has. And as Michael Matias says, it's a balance between what the narrative allows you to do and tells you you're able to do and what the gameplay allows. And when those are out of balance, you see low agency. And once we get to the examples, I'll talk more about that, but I just wanted to bring it up and really discuss where it came from, because I think that was really what got me to want to do this episode, is talking about the amount of agency in a game and how just because something is heavily scripted, it doesn't mean there isn't agency. So back to why is it hard to do scripted failure in a game? It's because a lot of the time scripted failure breaks that feeling of agency, because it's very obvious that you were supposed to fail and the narrative wanted you to fail, but the gameplay didn't make it feel like you were going to fail, and it never really set up the fact that you were able to fail. And when we get more into the examples later, I'm going to talk more about how the narrative has to work with the gameplay to allow a scripted failure to not feel terrible. And it's hard, and I'm going to try and show an example of it done right, at least in my opinion. If you don't think the example I'm using of good scripted failure is right, feel free to comment, but I'm going to try and discuss why I think it's a good failure versus a lot of the other failures in games where you feel bad, not emotionally, but you feel like you've been kicked out of the experience. To segue into my examples on scripted failure, and especially the Free Space example, I wanted to talk about what I think makes a good scripted failure. And I wanted to start talking about the narrative, because I think scripting a failure in the narrative is much easier, simply because we've been writing stories with failure in them, and most stories have the protagonist failing at some point. Now, to make an effective failure in your narrative, you need to foreshadow it to some extent. The amount you do and really the quality of it and everything, that's dependent on the kind of story you're telling and how much you want the failure to be a surprise. I've seen plenty of foreshadowing where it's obvious for a very long time that there's going to be some sort of failure, and I've seen it just barely hinted at, but it's always hinted at. You cannot just pull one out of the blue, because it's going to feel horribly inorganic to your story, and it's going to cheapen the effect of the failure. And failure is a really good character moment or a really good plot moment, and you want to make it effective. And if it's just coming out of nowhere, it's not going to be effective, and you're not going to get the character development and the audience investment you want out of the failure. Now comes the hard part. It's how do you set up your gameplay in such a way that the failure while you're playing doesn't feel like it's ripping your agency away. And that's what this video is really about. And I think the hardest part about dealing with failure through the gameplay that isn't a sort of traditional style of failure like player death or running out of time, because those things will reset the player to a previous point in the game and they'll be able to try it again. Whereas a narrative failure that you want through the gameplay cannot be reset. There's no way around it. And how do you make that feel natural? Well, you first need to have your narrative work in such a way that you have foreshadowed your scripted failure well enough. But that's only a fraction of it. You obviously want the player to be aware of the fact that they can fail, But you also need to telegraph to the player that they are not infallible. They are not able to solve every problem. They're not able to complete all of their objectives all of the time. And that's a big pitfall in a lot of games because most games in today's world are about empowerment. And if you're failing a lot, you're not going to feel empowered. So you need to balance the empowerment with your story if you want the protagonist and player to fail. And that's hard. And for me, the best way to go about doing it is really the way of free space, and a lot of space combat games have done it, which is you have little failures here and there. They're not hugely important, and even if they're on the more important side, they're still not hugely impactful on the player. And it's very obvious why they failed. And that's, I think, the big important thing about the failure in the gameplay is you need to make it obvious in the game itself why the player is failing. You cannot just end with a cutscene of the player failing when they've been doing well. You have to give them some sort of overwhelming odds or take something away from them that would otherwise make them able to succeed. First, let's look at free space as a whole and really compare and contrast it to most action games in today's world. I'll admit it's a 15-year-old game, but I think it has a lot we can learn still. And it's one of the few games where you are an important part of the story, but you're just a completely average person. You don't even have a name outside of your call sign. And I think that's really important as to why its scripted failures work. You are just a pilot. There is nothing special about you other than you get certain assignments for whatever reason. But you're still just a completely average human being. And because of that, you're allowed to fail. You're set up for failure. And also that's part of the narrative is the Shivans, the main antagonists of the game, get introduced and nobody knows anything about them. They're completely superior. They're in the gameplay, they're completely superior from the get-go. And when they're introduced, you can't target them. They're just so far ahead of anything else in the game that it really flips the switch in your head that says, oh shit, we can't deal with this. We don't know what to do. And that gives it a very huge advantage over a lot of other games where they try and script failure, because the minute the main antagonists get introduced, you cannot deal with them. There is nothing in your tool set that says you are going to be able to win. That expectation, I think, is hugely important as to why the scripted failures in the game work. Because you are thrown up against something you cannot possibly fight from the beginning of the game. And that gets expanded upon when the giant Shivan super destroyer shows up and is invulnerable and you can't do anything about it, and it is destroying planets. When it shows up, it's really this just overwhelming thing. And it's built up through the entire game as this indestructible monstrosity. They set up the destruction of the main ship you're serving on, but they don't set it up too well simply because you're told, oh yeah, the giant Shivan super destroyer is in the area. That's the mission before the ship you're serving on gets blown up. But that's enough, and especially because you're in space and the enemies can come from anywhere and they're strong and they're unstoppable. There's always this threat. And on top of that, the ship you're serving on has come under attack before and you've fended things off. So when you get the message coming from a bombing run that says, watch out guys, the ship you've been serving on, it's under attack, we need your help. You're saying, okay, we should get out of this. We'll be fine. And then the Shivan super destroyer shows up, and that's it. You cannot kill it, you cannot harm it in the game at all, and that's it. And I think that's the big thing for me about why the scripted failure works. You were told through the narrative and cutscenes that you cannot possibly destroy this thing. And if you try to in the game, you can't. You will get annihilated. The ship you're serving on will get annihilated. You cannot touch it. And that's the important thing, is not only in the narrative is this thing unkillable, in the game it's unkillable. And when you see it show up, and it is a little bit bigger than the Galatea, the ship you're serving on, you know everything is over. And that's the important part. When you see the Lucifer show up, you know it's over. The Galatea is disabled, it can't go anywhere, and the giant super destroyer that's killing planets shows up. And you cannot possibly damage it. That's the big thing, is both the narrative and the gameplay are telling you the same thing. That's why even though you're forced to fail, you don't feel like the game is ripping your agency away because both the narrative and the gameplay are in the same direction. So even if it doesn't seem like you have that agency, this is really what Michael Matthias talks about when he's talking about agency is the narrative says you can only do a certain number of things, and the gameplay only says you can do the same certain number of things. You're still able to fly just about anywhere in the little area you're given you want. You can fly up to the Lucifer and try and attack it, but that doesn't do anything. And that's the important thing, is the gameplay also doesn't get changed dramatically when the Lucifer shows up. You're still playing the exact same game you've been playing the whole time. Now you're just given a ship that you can't kill. Nothing else has changed. And you're told, I think about 9 missions before the Lucifer shows up and destroys the Galatée, you're told, yeah, we can't kill this. We can't do anything about it. It's just going to rampage out here until we can figure out what's going on and how to stop it. And that's the other important thing, is you are told far in advance that there's something you cannot possibly deal with that nobody in the narrative can possibly deal with. And everything I've just mentioned put together, that's why I think Free Space's scripted failure of the Galatée being destroyed is such a good example. And I remember the first time I played through that game, I felt terrible after that mission. And it wasn't the same, oh my god, this game just ripped me away from the experience. It was, wow, I didn't think anything could get worse than that. But they just blew up the ship I'd been on for the entire game. What am I going to do? And that's what they were going for. And at least with me, they hit it right on the head. Because the minute the Lucifer showed up, I knew everything was done. And that really is the feeling that you want from a scripted failure, is that feeling of hopelessness and just anxiety about what's going to happen now. And that's when it's done right. What you're getting when you do a scripted failure right isn't a big emotional impact. Not that feeling of agency being torn away. And now I want to talk about Mass Effect and Mass Effect 3 specifically in the Kai Lang first boss fight, which has a lot of problems. We're going to talk about them. But I also want to just say Mass Effect is one of my favorite series. I still like it, but part of why I'm so willing to jump on it and attack the problems I see in it is because of how much I loved it. And that's just something to keep in mind when I talk about it, is I'm ripping it apart because of how much I love it. So let's talk about Kai Lang's first boss fight on Thessia. And it has some of the telltale signs of being a bad scripted failure from the get-go. The players encountered him once, and he's not really made out to be that great when you see him. He's talked about as being this really badass assassin, but what you see is he's not very good. And he's not really made out to be a great threat, especially because he doesn't really accomplish his goal at all when you first meet him. And that already sets him up as being kind of bad at his job, regardless of what the other characters have said. And that's fairly early in the game. And then he doesn't get mentioned very often, hardly at all. And I remember playing through this the first time, and I forgot about him. He was not memorable enough for me to even remember him the 5 to 10 hours later he shows up. Because of him not being on my mind, I was not expecting him to be there. And they don't foreshadow Cerberus or him it being on Thessia at all. And that's a big problem, because you can't script a failure in the narrative without at least hinting at it. You can be subtle, but you need it to be there in some capacity before it happens. Otherwise, you get this problem of it being completely out of the blue and not feeling organic at all. I remember him showing up and thinking, what was going on? Why is he here? How did he get here without anybody noticing? And you don't want that. You don't want that to happen in your scripted failure, because it's going to take people out of the experience. And it really took me out of the experience. Also because there's no options available to the player in it. You have to fight him. You have to break his shield, and then he will make you fail by throwing you into a pit. And that's not organic. You don't want that. That feels very forced in your story. Unlike the Lucifer destroying the Galate, the gameplay and the narrative in Kai Lang's boss fight go in completely opposite directions. The narrative is saying he decides he's just going to throw you into a pit, while the gameplay says you've been damaging him and you might win. That disconnect is really the problem and why this moment has no agency. You're set up to fail, but you're not given any way of knowing that you're going to fail, because the gameplay is saying you're going to be able to kill him here, and that's the problem. When the gameplay and narrative are in completely different directions, you don't have the feeling of agency. I'll use my own personal anecdotes of, I already talked about how bad I felt when the Galate was destroyed. That was more shock and the emotion of what happened than anything else. And I was in a very emotional state after I failed, after Kai Lang beat me, but it wasn't because of what happened in the same way. When I was distraught over the destruction of the Galate, it was more about what was going on in the story, and I was invested in the story, and I felt like I was there. Whereas what happened with Kai Lang, I felt like the game just wanted me to stop playing at that point, because obviously whatever I did wasn't going to matter. It was going to do its own thing and not care about what I was doing. And I was very close to just putting the controller down at that point. Even when I was doing the recording for this video, I stopped playing after that point because it still felt terrible. The 3 years after I beat it the first time, I went back and I played it, and it still felt horribly inorganic. Honestly, to make matters worse, he sends you this taunting email, and that honestly adds more insult to injury than anything else, because you can't do anything. The player is forced into this situation, and then the game taunts you. And that was my biggest problem with it, is the game's taunting me and I can't do anything about it, and I know the game knows I can't do anything about it, but it's still going to taunt me that, oh yeah, you failed and your best wasn't good enough. Well, my best was cut short. I'm sorry. To wrap everything up, the combination of Mass Effect not generally having scripted failure, plus the failure in Mass Effect 3 not being foreshadowed at all, and Kai Lang just showing up out of nowhere, even being forgotten by that point, that plus the fight ending as a cutscene when the player breaks his shield, everything combined there makes for a horribly inorganic failure, and it's incredibly noticeable. That's really what I wanted to point out, is every one of these things being put together means that failure is going to stick with players, but not for the emotional reasons the designers want. It's going to stick with them because it feels forced, and when it feels forced, it's going to break people out of the experience. What I want you guys to get out of this video is that scripted failures themselves are not a problem. They're just extremely difficult to get right, and when they're done wrong, which a lot of the time they are, they're very jarring and really immersion breaking. But when they're done right, like my example with Free Space, they can be extremely effective for getting an emotional reaction out of somebody. And really, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and catch you all later.